There is a photograph taken at Eagle Farm Airfield outside Brisbane in the late winter of 1942, and if you didn't know what you were looking at, you'd walk right past it. A twin-engine bomber with its nose peeled open like a tin can. Two mechanics on a wooden ladder. A shower of sparks coming off a welding torch. And standing back a few feet, arms folded, a man in a sweat-ruined flight suit who looks about 10 years older than everyone else in the frame. He's 43. His hair has already gone gray at the temples. Somebody in the ground crew started calling him Pappy because he was old enough to be the father of most of the pilots he flew with, and the name stuck so hard that within 2 years, generals were using it in official correspondence. What the mechanics were welding into that nose was 4 Browning .50 caliber machine guns, stripped out of fighter aircraft that had crashed and would never fly again. There was no engineering order authorizing this. There were no stress calculations. There was no wind tunnel data, no blueprint from a drafting table in Ohio, no approval from anybody at Wright Field who had spent his career learning what an airplane could and could not be asked to carry. There was a chief mechanic, a pencil sketch, a scrap pile, and a man who had worked out something the entire Army Air Forces had somehow failed to work out in 3 years of war. 8 months later, 12 of those bastardized airplanes flew out over the Bismarck Sea, and, in a little under 72 hours, helped destroy an entire Japanese convoy, every transport on the bottom. Half the destroyer escort with it. The Imperial Japanese Army never again tried to move a division into New Guinea by sea, and at almost the exact moment that was happening, a formal engineering assessment was sitting on a desk in the United States, explaining, in careful technical language, that the aircraft which had just done it could not possibly work. This is the story of Paul Irvin Gunn. It's a story about a machine, and it is also a story about a man who spent 3.5 years of the worst war in human history trying to get to a walled compound in Manila, where his wife and 4 children were slowly starving to death. Those two things are not separate. You cannot understand the airplane without the family. That's the part everybody leaves out. He was born in Arkansas in 1899 in a place called Quitman, which was farm country and not much else. He was one of a great many children in a household that had no money to speak of, and he got out the way a lot of poor boys got out in that generation, which was to walk into a recruiting office as soon as anybody would take him. He joined the Navy at 17. The Navy figured out fairly quickly that he had hands. There are men who understand machinery in a theoretical way, and there are men who understand it the way a surgeon understands an abdomen, and Gunn was the second kind. He worked on engines. He worked on airframes. He got himself into flight training and came out the other side a chief aviation pilot, which is a rating that barely exists anymore, and which meant, in practice, that he was an enlisted man who flew airplanes at least as well as the officers did and fixed them better. He spent 21 years in the Navy. He flew off carriers when carriers were an experiment. He taught other men to fly. And in 1939, with a pension and a wife named Polly and 4 children, he took his retirement and did something that, in hindsight, looks either visionary or insane, depending on how much you know about what was coming. He moved his family to Manila and started an airline, Philippine Airlines. 5 Beechcraft Model 18S, a twin-engine airplane about the size of a modern executive turboprop, hopping between islands in an archipelago with 7,000 of them. Manila to Baguio, Manila to Cebu, Cebu to Davao. He flew the routes himself, he serviced the airplanes himself, and when a landing gear leg cracked somewhere out in the provinces, he got out with a toolbox and fixed it on the strip. The family lived well. Not rich, but well. Polly ran the house. Nath, the oldest boy, was becoming a teenager. There were 2 girls and another boy. They had a home, they had a country they'd chosen, and for about 2 years they had the kind of life that people spend their whole working lives trying to build. That life ended at 3 a.m. on December 8, 1941. Manila is on the other side of the international date line from Hawaii, so while it was still December 7th at Pearl Harbor, it was already the 8th in the Philippines, and within hours Japanese aircraft were over Clark Field and Iba Field, catching most of the American air strength on the ground and burning it there. By the end of that first day, the United States Far East Air Force had essentially ceased to exist as a fighting organization. The Army needed airplanes. Any airplanes. Gunn had 5 of them. They took the Beechcrafts, and to make the seizure orderly, they commissioned Gunn a captain in the United States Army Air Forces on the spot. 42 years old, 21 years of Navy service behind him, and suddenly, he was an Army captain flying his own commercial aircraft on military missions in a war that was already lost in that theater, and everybody knew it. Here is where his war becomes personal in a way that never let go of him. He flew constantly through those first weeks. Down to Del Monte on Mindanao, out to Australia, back again, carrying ammunition, radio equipment, medical supplies, senior officers, anything that had to move. He flew unarmed transports through airspace crawling with zeros because there was nobody else who knew the islands well enough to do it. He got people out. He got them out by the dozens. He could not get out his own family. By the time it became clear that Manila was going to fall, he was gone, and the airplanes he might have used were committed elsewhere, and the timing simply never worked. There is more than one account of how it happened, and they differ in the details, and it doesn't matter, because the outcome is the same in all of them. Manila was declared an open city on December 26th. The Japanese entered on January 2, 1942, and Polly Gunn and 4 children were rounded up along with several thousand other Allied civilians and marched into the campus of Santo Tomas University, which the Japanese had wired off and turned into an internment camp. Gunn was in the air over the southern islands when he found out. Think about what that does to a man. He is 42. He is a captain in an army he only joined 3 weeks ago. He has just spent a month flying other people's children to safety, and his own are behind wire in a city he can put a finger on from the cockpit, and there is not one single thing he can do about it except win the war and come back. For the next 3 years, everything he built was, in some sense, a device for getting to Manila. The 5th Air Force in the middle of 1942 was in bad shape. It had a scattering of worn-out aircraft, spare parts that mostly did not exist, and a mission that appeared to be arithmetically impossible. Stop the Imperial Japanese Army from reinforcing New Guinea, which they were doing more or less whenever they felt like it, by ship, in daylight. The problem was not courage, the problem was geometry. American bombing doctrine before the war had been built around one idea, and that idea was altitude. You fly high, above the flak, above the fighters, and you use a precision bomb sight to put ordnance on a fixed target. Against a factory or a rail yard, this worked well enough. Against a ship at sea, it was very nearly useless, and the reason is not complicated. A bomb released from 20,000 feet takes the better part of half a minute to fall. In half a minute, a merchant ship making 12 knots moves about 100 yards. In half a minute, a destroyer under helm can be somewhere else entirely. So the bombardier is not aiming at a ship. He is aiming at a prediction of where a ship will be, made by a captain who is watching the bombers overhead and has every incentive to make that prediction wrong. The numbers from that summer are brutal. Sortie after sortie, hundreds of bombs, and a hit rate that in some operations rounded down to nothing. Crews came home and reported hits in good faith because from 20,000 feet a near miss, throwing up a column of white water, looks exactly like a hit. Then reconnaissance would go out the next day and find the same convoy still steaming, still intact, still delivering troops. And when the bombers went lower to improve their odds, the ships killed them. A Japanese destroyer had guns designed for precisely that problem, and a transport carried anti-aircraft weapons on every open deck. A bomber coming in low and level, slow, predictable, was the easiest target in the world. George Kenney arrived in the theater in August of 1942 to take over the 5th Air Force, and he was a different animal from his predecessors. He was small, blunt, and profane. He had flown in the First War, and he had spent a good part of the interwar years in experimental armament work. He was not romantic about doctrine. What he wanted was ships on the bottom, and he did not much care what the manual said about how to put them there. Within days of arriving, he was told about a captain in the maintenance organization who kept modifying aircraft without permission. Kenny went to look. What he found was a man who had already come to a conclusion that most of the air forces had not. Gunn's reasoning went like this, and it is worth following because it is the whole war in 4 steps. Step 1. To hit a ship, you have to be low. Not lower. Low. Low enough that the bomb travels almost flat, and the pilot is aiming the airplane rather than the bombardier aiming a sight. Step 2. At that altitude, you can skip a bomb off the water like a stone off a pond, and it will hit the ship in the hull, at the waterline, where it does real damage, instead of on the deck. Step 3. To get to that release point, you have to fly straight down the throat of every gun the ship has, for the better part of a mile, with nowhere to hide. Step 4. Therefore, the only thing that matters is whether you can kill the gun crews before they kill you. That last step is the one nobody else had properly grasped. The whole problem collapses into a firepower race that lasts about 8 seconds. Whoever wins those 8 seconds lives. And bombers, as designed, were built to lose them. A B-25 Mitchell came from the factory with a bombardier and a glass nose and a single flexible machine gun he could wave around. An A-20 Havoc had a light battery of 30 caliber guns, and 30 caliber rounds against a ship's superstructure were about as effective as thrown gravel. Gunn's answer was to take the bombardier out of the airplane entirely. He started with the A-20 because that's what was available, and because it had a second problem he could solve at the same time. The Havoc was fast, and it handled beautifully, and it could not reach anything. Its range from the fields around Port Moresby was short enough that most of the targets worth hitting were simply out of reach across the Owen Stanley Range. So he built it a fuel tank. He took drop tanks meant for fighter aircraft, fitted them into the forward bomb bay, plumbed them in, and gave the airplane the legs to reach New Guinea's north coast and come home. Then he did the nose. The bombardier's compartment came out. In its place went a steel framework carrying 4 50 caliber Brownings, fixed, bore-sighted straight ahead, fired by the pilot with a button on the control column. He got the guns wherever guns could be got. Wrecked P-40S. Wrecked P-39S. Aircraft that had been written off in landing accidents or shot up badly enough to be scrapped. He had men going through boneyards with wrenches. The first flights were ugly. Each gun weighed 64 pounds. Add mounts, add ammunition boxes, add the steel to hold it all, and you have put a few hundred pounds into the very front of an airframe that was balanced without it. The airplane wanted to fly nose down. On the first attempts it barely climbed and felt, according to the men who flew it, like something actively trying to kill them. A factory engineer would have solved this with a fresh weight and balance calculation and a redesign. Gunn solved it by moving things backwards. Radio equipment after no. Batteries aft. Anything heavy that could live in the tail went to the tail. He shifted, he test flew, he shifted again. And when the guns fired, the muzzle blast started tearing at the aluminum skin, so he fabricated blast tubes to carry the shock forward past the structure, and he reinforced the panels with heavier gauge sheet. None of this appears in any manual. It was done by feel, by a man who had spent 25 years learning what airplanes tolerate. On the 12th of September, 1942, a formation of these modified Havocs went in on the Japanese airstrip at Buna at the height of the palm trees. They came across the field with 16 guns hammering per flight, and what happened to the aircraft parked there, and to the men in the anti-aircraft pits, was not really combat in the ordinary sense. They wrecked the field. They did not lose an airplane. Kenny had his answer. Now he wanted it on something bigger. The A-20 was a good airplane, but its bomb load was light, and its range, even with Gunn's tanks, was finite. What Kenny wanted was the same idea applied to the B-25 Mitchell, which could carry more, go further, and had a nose section with real volume in it. So in the last weeks of 1942, in a hangar in Townsville, Gunn took a B-25C apart. He pulled the bombardier's station out. 4 50 calibers went into the solid nose. Then he built external packages onto the sides of the forward fuselage, 2 guns to a side, faired in with sheet metal, which the crews called cheek guns or blister packs. That made 8. Then he locked the upper turret in the forward position, which added 2 more that the pilot could fire at the same time. 10 guns, all pointing the same way, all firing at once, in a single airplane. The ground crews looked at it and called it Pappy's Folly. The nickname was affectionate, and it was also a real prediction, because everything about the airplane on the ramp looked wrong. It sat nose low. It was heavy in a place airplanes are not supposed to be heavy. The first time Gunn flew the prototype, he had to hold back pressure on the yoke through the entire takeoff run just to get the nose wheel off the ground, and the airplane climbed away in a mood, but it flew. And when the guns fired, the effect was not like an airplane shooting. It was like standing in front of a wall. There's a description from one of the pilots who flew an early strafer that I think about a lot. He said the recoil of all those guns going off together was enough to feel in the airframe as a deceleration, as though the airplane had put a hand out. When the fire hit the water on the approach, it did not look like bullet splashes. It looked like something enormous was being dragged across the surface toward the ship. Kenny saw it and ordered every available B-25 in the theater converted. The 81st Air Depot Group at Townsville went on to 18-hour days. There were not enough guns, so they went and found guns. There were not enough gun mounts, so they made gun mounts out of whatever steel stock existed in northern Australia. Depot crews who had spent months doing routine maintenance were suddenly building the most heavily armed aircraft in the world, in a corrugated iron shed in the tropics with hand tools. By February of 1943, they had a squadron's worth of them. The airplane was only half the weapon, though. The other half was the tactic, and the tactic had to be learned, and there was not a lot of time to learn it. Skip bombing sounds simple when you describe it. Fly at the ship at masthead height, 200 feet or less, release the bomb short of the target, let it bounce off the water and into the hull. In practice, it is one of the more demanding things ever asked of a bomber crew. Too high and the bomb digs in and detonates in open water. Too low and you fly into the ship. Release too early and the bomb runs out of energy. Release too late and it goes over the top and you are then flying through your own explosion, which is why the bombs were fitted with delayed fuses. 5 seconds, long enough for the airplane to get clear before the thing went off. The man who beat this into the squadrons was a major named Ed Larner, who commanded the 90th Bomb Squadron of the 3rd Attack Group. Larner was young, aggressive to a degree that worried his superiors, and possessed of exactly the temperament this job required, which is to say, he was completely convinced that the correct range at which to attack a warship was point blank. There was a wrecked freighter sitting in Port Moresby Harbor called the Pruth, aground on a reef, rusting. Larner's crews used it as a target. Day after day, run after run, 20 feet, 50 feet, watching where the bombs went, arguing about it on the ground, going up and doing it again. Men who had trained for years to bomb from 4 miles up were relearning their trade at the altitude of a rooftop. Meanwhile, the paperwork was catching up. Kenny had sent details of the modifications back to the United States, partly as a courtesy and partly because he wanted the factories to start building the aircraft this way, rather than making him rebuild each one by hand in a shed. The material went to Wright Field in Ohio, which was where the Army Air Forces did its engineering evaluation, and which was staffed by extremely competent professionals who had every reason to be skeptical. Their response was thorough and it was negative. The center of gravity was outside acceptable limits. The forward structure was not designed to absorb the recoil and vibration of that many heavy machine guns firing simultaneously. The skin would fatigue around the cheek mounts. The airplane's handling in an engine-out situation, already demanding in a Mitchell, would become dangerous. The modifications had not been through any recognized test program. The recommendation, as it came back across the Pacific, was that the modified aircraft be grounded. And I want to be fair here, because the easy version of this story makes the engineers into villains, and they were not villains. Every single one of those objections was, in a narrow technical sense, correct. The airplane was out of balance. The structure was overstressed. The skin did crack. Gunn's Mitchells were harder to fly, less forgiving, and more likely to kill you on one engine than the airplane North American had designed. The engineers were measuring the airplane against a standard. Gunn was measuring it against the alternative, and the alternative was crews dying in the Coral Sea for no result at all. Kenny happened to be in Washington when the report came through. He was called into a meeting at Hap Arnold's headquarters, where the technical people were prepared to explain why his theater had been building an aircraft that could not fly. What Kenny told them, in substance, was that his impossible airplanes had just annihilated a Japanese convoy in the Bismarck Sea, that every transport in it was on the bottom, and that he had 60 more of the impossible airplanes in work in Australia and intended to build all of them. The meeting did not last much longer. Here is what had happened in those 72 hours. Toward the end of February 1943, the Japanese command at Rabaul put together a reinforcement operation for Lae on the north coast of New Guinea. The 51st Division was to be moved across, and the plan on paper was sound. 8 transports carrying somewhere close to 7,000 troops, screened by 8 destroyers, sailing at the end of the month with the weather forecast on their side. March in that part of the world means monsoon. Low cloud, heavy rain, poor visibility. The convoy's staff expected to spend most of the passage invisible. They were not invisible, and the reason was that Allied cryptanalysts had been reading their mail. The intelligence organizations working on Japanese naval and army traffic had enough of the picture to tell Kenny what was coming, roughly when and roughly where. He did not have to search 400 miles of ocean. He had to wait in the right place. He used the time. Squadrons rehearsed a coordinated attack, which was itself a new idea. The plan was to arrive over the convoy with everything at once, at different altitudes, from different directions, so that the ship's gunners would be forced to make choices under time pressure and would make the wrong ones. Heavy bombers high. Australian bow fighters coming in low with their 4 cannon and 6 machine guns, an aircraft the Japanese frequently mistook for a torpedo bomber, which meant crews would turn their bows toward it and present the narrowest possible target to the people who were actually about to attack. Medium bombers at medium height, and gun strafers at the height of the mastheads. P-38S would deal with whatever fighter cover showed up. The convoy sailed on the last night of February into weather that did exactly what the Japanese had hoped for about a day and a half. A patrolling B-24 found them on the afternoon of March 2nd in a gap in the cloud in the Bismarck Sea north of New Britain. The heavy bombers went out first. B-17S attacked from altitude that afternoon, doing what heavy bombers do, and in among a great many misses they got a real result. The transport Kyokusei Maru hit and sunk with about 1,200 troops aboard. Some were pulled from the water by the destroyers, which then ran ahead to Lae and came back, and that detail matters later, because it took 2 escorts out of the screen at the worst possible time. That night, a Catalina flying boat shadowed the convoy in the dark, circling, reporting, never letting go. Imagine being on those ships. You cannot see the aircraft, you can hear it. All night, that engine note somewhere above the overcast, and everyone aboard knows exactly what it means about the morning. The morning came clear. That is the part the Japanese staff had not planned for. The weather that had covered them for 2 days broke up as the convoy came around into the Huon Gulf, and on the 3rd of March, the sky over the Bismarck Sea was open. The strike force assembled over Cape Ward Hunt at around 9:30 in the morning. Something on the order of 100 aircraft, in layers, all arriving in the same few minutes. The B-17S went in first, from high up, and the ships did what ships do, which was to break formation and start maneuvering hard, throwing up everything they had at the aircraft overhead. Every gun crew on every deck was looking up. Then the bow fighters came out of the haze at wave height. The Japanese ships turned toward them, expecting torpedoes. That turn presented their length to nobody, and their bows to the wrong threat, and the Australians came down their decks with cannon fire that swept the open gun positions from stem to stern. Men standing at unshielded anti-aircraft mounts on the deck of a transport had no protection worth the name. And then, into that, at about the height of a 2-story building, came Larner's B-25S. There were 12 of them, They came in line abreast, spread across a front several hundred yards wide, so that a ship trying to turn away from one was turning into the guns of another. And at about a mile out, the noses lit up. The men who survived on those decks described the fire arriving before the aircraft did. A B-25 strafer at that range put out something on the order of 100 rounds a second from a single airframe, and there were 12 airframes. The 50 caliber stream walked across the water in a boiling white line, climbed the side of the ship, and went through the bridge windows, the gun tubs, the boat deck, the ventilators, the men. Steel plate on a merchant hull is thin. It did not stop those rounds. It just decided where they went afterward. Then, 4 or 5 seconds later, the bombs. Larner's squadron released at a few hundred feet of range, low enough that the crews were looking up at the masts as they went past. The bombs came off flat, hit the water once, and went into the hulls at the waterline with a 5-second delay on the fuse. The airplane was already gone when they detonated. Inside the ship, below the deck, in the engine spaces and the holds where several hundred soldiers were sitting on their packs, waiting for a landing that was never going to happen. The 90th claimed 17 hits out of the bombs it dropped that morning. Post-war analysis, which is usually merciless about combat claims, could not do much to knock that down. It was one of the highest bombing accuracy figures recorded by any unit in the war, achieved by an airplane a technical evaluation board had recommended grounding. What happened over the next hour is difficult to describe as a battle, because a battle implies an exchange. The transport Teyo Maru took bombs and went down. Aikoku Maru, Shinai Maru, Taimei Maru, Kembu Maru, which was carrying aviation fuel in drums, and which did not sink so much as vanish. Oigawa Maru. Ships that had been in formation 2 hours earlier were burning individually across 40 miles of open water, some of them still underway with nobody left alive on the bridge to stop the engines. The destroyers came off no better. Shirayuki was hit forward, and the explosion took her bow off. Her crew was taken off and she was scuttled. Tokitsukaze went down. Arashio was hit and, out of control, collided with the transport Nojima. Asashio came back into the scattered wreckage in the afternoon to pick up survivors from the water, which is the correct and honorable thing for a destroyer captain to do, and it is also the reason that a formation of American aircraft found her stopped and full of men and put bombs into her. By the end of the 3rd of March, of 8 transports and 8 destroyers that had left Rabaul, not one transport was left afloat. 4 destroyers were gone with them. The 4 that survived did so by running. Of the roughly 6,900 men who had sailed, something under 1,000 ever reached Leh. Around 2,500 were plucked out of the sea by the surviving escorts and carried back to Rabaul, which meant that after a week of planning and a division's worth of shipping, the Japanese army in New Guinea was reinforced by approximately nobody. The remainder, close to 3,000 men, died in the Bismarck Sea. Allied losses for the operation were 1 heavy bomber and a small number of fighters. 13 airmen killed. I want to be honest about the last day of this, because a lot of tellings skip it, and I don't think that's right. On the 4th of March, and for some days afterward, Allied aircraft and American PT boats went back out over the wreckage and attacked lifeboats, rafts, and men in the water. Kenny ordered it. The reasoning given at the time was that these were not shipwrecked sailors, but combat infantry who were within swimming distance of a coastline held by the Japanese, and that any man who reached the shore would shortly be shooting at Australian and American soldiers. That reasoning was accepted up the chain. It was also, by any reading, an ugly thing to ask men to do, and a number of the crews who did it never talked about it afterward, and some who did talk about it plainly said it was the worst thing they were part of in the entire war. That is in the record too. The story does not work if you only take the parts that flatter. What went into the communiques afterward was something else again. MacArthur's headquarters announced a victory considerably larger than the one that had actually occurred. 22 ships sunk, 12,000 men drowned. Those numbers were wrong, and they stayed in print for years, and when Air Force historians went back through the Japanese records after the war and produced accurate figures, MacArthur's staff pushed back hard against the correction. The true result was one of the most complete defeats of the Pacific War. It simply wasn't large enough for the press release. And underneath the communiqué, there was the other paperwork, the kind nobody publishes. Loss reports, missing aircrew reports, a form with a name typed on it, a serial number, an aircraft tail number, a set of coordinates, and a line for remarks that is usually short and sometimes blank. Somewhere in Melbourne and Brisbane and Washington, clerks were typing those out while the smoke was still on the water, and then filing them, and the copy that went to a house in Ohio or Queensland said almost nothing at all. That gap between what a family was told and what actually happened is the reason I wrote a book, and it's in the description. It's called Find Your Grandfather's War, a guide to reconstructing an American serviceman's war from the fragments most families are left holding. A name. A photograph with nothing on the back. A box of objects nobody ever explained. There are more records than people realize, and they can be read, and the man in them usually turns out to be someone you never quite met. Now, back to Australia, where a report was being finalized. The right field assessment explaining that Gunn's B-25 could not work had not been withdrawn. It was still moving through channels. It arrived in a world that had changed while it was in transit. Kenny sent a signal to Hap Arnold on the 5th of March, and the substance of it was short. 12 modified Mitchells had just helped destroy a Japanese convoy at masthead height, and he wanted the forward gun package designed into the production airplane at the factory, immediately, on every aircraft coming off the line. Arnold called North American Aviation. North American's engineers, quite reasonably, wanted to see what they were being asked to build. Arnold said he would send them the man who built it. And that is how, in the last days of March 1943, Paul Gunn found himself on a transport aircraft, heading east across the Pacific, away from the war and away from Manila. He did not want to go. There is no ambiguity about this in any account. His family was in Santo Tomas and had been for 14 months. The reports coming out of the camp were getting worse, and every mile toward California was a mile in the wrong direction. Kenny made it an order and promised him 6 weeks. The North American plant at Long Beach was a different planet. Acres of floor, 20,000 people. An assembly line producing a finished B-25 every few hours, run by production engineers who worked in tolerances and tooling and lead times. Into this walked a middle-aged colonel with a roll of hand-drawn sketches. The conversations that followed have become a bit legendary, and were probably less cinematic than the retellings, but the shape of them is well attested. The engineers asked about stress analysis. There wasn't any. They asked about wind tunnel work. He said he had tested it by flying it. They asked about the center of gravity, and he showed them, in pencil, where he had moved the radios and the batteries and roughly how much that had bought him. They told him the skin would fail around the cheek guns from muzzle blast, and he agreed, because it had, and then showed them the blast tubes and the doubler plates he had made to fix it. They did the thing good engineers do, which is stop arguing and start measuring. Over the following weeks, North American reverse-engineered a field modification into a production design. They strengthened the nose structure properly. They redesigned the mounts so the recoil path went into structure instead of skin. They ran the weight and balance and adjusted the trim authority so a pilot did not need both arms on the yoke to get airborne. Everything Wright Field had said was a problem. They solved, one at a time, because the airplane had already proved the concept was worth the effort. The result was the B-25G, which reached the line in the spring of 1943, and which carried, along with its forward machine guns, a 75mm cannon. That cannon is one of the strangest things ever put in an airplane. It was a version of the field gun that had been fitted to American tanks, mounted in a tunnel along the lower fuselage, hand-loaded by the navigator, who had to shove a 15-pound round into the breech while the airplane was in a low-level attack run. When it fired, the entire aircraft shuddered and slowed. Rate of fire was around every 20 or 30 seconds, depending on how good your navigator was and how much he wanted to live. Gunn flew the prototype and told them, essentially, that it would do fine against something big and slow, and not much against anything else. That turned out to be exactly right. The cannon sank ships and blew up bunkers and was eventually dropped, because it turned out that what pilots actually wanted was more machine guns, which is what they got. The B-25H added guns in the cheek packs and kept the cannon. And then came the B-25J with the strafer nose, which threw the cannon out and replaced it with 850 calibers in the nose, 4 more in the packs, and the top turret firing forward. 18 guns pointing the same direction. North American built the J variant in the thousands. It is, by a comfortable margin, the most heavily gunned bomber ever mass-produced by anyone. All of it traced back to a pencil sketch and a scrap pile in Australia. Gunn was back in the Pacific in 6 weeks, as promised. And the war he came back to was the war he had made. Through the rest of 1943, the strafers went hunting. Barge traffic along the New Guinea coast, coastal shipping, supply dumps. The Japanese response was to stop moving anything in daylight, so the squadrons learned to work at night. They learned to attack in coordination with PT boats that would illuminate a target with a searchlight at the last possible second. The crews got very good, and the Japanese, according to their own accounts, came to dread these aircraft in a specific and personal way, because there was no altitude at which the strafers were not a threat, and no cloud low enough to hide under. On the 2nd of November, 1943, the strafers went into Rabaul Harbor itself, which was the strongest Japanese position in the South Pacific, and ringed with anti-aircraft batteries. They came across Simpson Harbor at masthead height through smoke, into fire that the crews afterward described as solid. Ships were hit, badly, and the harbor stopped functioning as the forward base it had been. The cost was real. Among the men killed that day was Major Raymond Wilkins, who had gone in last to cover the withdrawal of the rest of his squadron, drew the fire onto himself deliberately, put a bomb into a transport, and was shot down into the water. He received the Medal of Honor for it. He was 26. Gunn flew that mission. He was 44 years old. He held a staff appointment, and nothing in his job description required him to be over Rabaul in an airplane. He kept going anyway, and the reason had not changed. The line of advance ran through Rabaul to the Philippines, and the Philippines ran to Manila, and Manila was where his family was. The reports coming out of Santo Tomas by then were bad and getting worse. Rations cut, then cut again. Medicine gone. People dying of things that do not kill well-fed people. And a standing fear among the internees, which they discussed openly among themselves, that if American forces came close enough, the garrison would kill them all before withdrawing. In October of 1944, the Americans landed at Leyte, and the Philippines campaign began, and Gunn was flying almost constantly. Then, in a Japanese air raid on the crowded strips at Leyte, he was caught in the open. The bomb fragments tore his arm apart. It was a severe wound, the kind that in another decade would have cost him the limb, and it ended his flying. Doctors talked about 6 months minimum, and probably longer, and about medical retirement, which he was entitled to several times over. He was 45 years old, with more than a quarter-century of service between 2 branches and 9 Purple Hearts worth of reasons to go home. He refused to be evacuated to the United States. He would not leave the theater. He was 250 miles from Manila, and there was no version of this where he went the other way. The 1st Cavalry Division sent a flying column into Manila on the 3rd of February, 1945, ahead of the main advance, moving fast specifically because of the internment camps and what might happen inside them. They came through the gates of Santo Tomas that evening. There was fighting on the campus. There was a standoff over hostages in one of the buildings. And then there were about 3,700 people, most of them barely able to stand, walking out into the open. Polly Gunn weighed a little over 80 pounds. The children had malaria, dysentery, the swollen bellies and thinned hair of long-term malnutrition. They had been eating a bowl of thin soup a day for months. Another few weeks, and some of them would not have made it, which is not dramatization. It is what the camp's own mortality figures were doing. Gunn got to Manila the next day, against medical advice, with his arm bandaged. He had been gone 3 years and 1 month. He had lost a great deal of weight himself. His hair had gone completely gray. And when he came into the makeshift ward where his family was being treated, Polly looked at him and did not know who he was. She thought he was one of the doctors. Then he said her name. That's it. That's the moment the whole airplane was built for. Every gun mount, every scrounged Browning, every argument with an engineer, every low pass through anti-aircraft fire at the height of a ship's rail. It all runs to a man standing in a hospital tent in a wrecked city while his wife works out who he is. The reunion lasted a few hours. Then he went back to work, because the war was not over, and Manila itself was about to be destroyed street by street in a month of fighting that killed something like 100,000 civilians. He never flew combat again. The arm would not allow it. He was retired as a colonel on a medical disability in 1948, at 48, and then he did the thing that says the most about him, which is that he went back to Manila and started the airline over. Philippine Airlines had ceased to exist. Its aircraft were gone, its offices were rubble. The country had been fought across twice, and the man rebuilding it had one working arm. He started with war surplus C-47S bought cheap because there were thousands of them and nobody wanted them. He flew the routes himself again, Manila to Cebu, Cebu to Davao, the same island hopping he had done in 1940, except this time over ruins. The airline grew fast. DC-3S, then larger 4-engine equipment. Routes to Hong Kong and Bangkok and Singapore. In 1946, PAL flew across the Pacific to the American West Coast, which made it the first Asian airline to do it, and it did that 18 months after Manila had been one of the most comprehensively wrecked cities on Earth. The Philippine government gave him the Distinguished Service Star. The American decorations had come earlier: Distinguished Flying Cross, Silver Star, Legion of Merit, and a stack of Purple Hearts. MacArthur recommended him for Brigadier General in 1945, and the recommendation went nowhere, because the war ended, the force structure contracted, and promotions stopped. He stayed a colonel, and by every account did not complain about it once. Kenny wrote about him later in flat, unsentimental terms, and said something close to this: that without Pappy Gunn's modifications, the Bismarck Sea would have gone the other way, and without the Bismarck Sea, New Guinea would have been lost, and without New Guinea, there is no road back to the Philippines at all. He could not sit still. His pilots noticed it. He flew constantly through the 50s, more than he needed to, more than an airline president has any business flying, always going somewhere. People who knew him well thought there was something in it he wasn't saying. On the 11th of October, 1957, he took off in a light twin into weather that turned out worse than the forecast, and the airplane went into a mountainside. He was killed instantly. He was 1 week short of his 58th birthday. The funeral in Manila drew thousands, American veterans, Filipino airline crews who had learned to fly from him. Former internees from Santo Tomas who came because a man had spent 3 years building weapons to get them out. And then he disappeared, more or less completely, from the public memory of the war. His son Nath went into the Air Force, flew B-52s over Vietnam, retired a colonel, and eventually wrote a book about his father, because he realized nobody else was going to. It sold modestly. There's a set of his father's original gun mount drawings in a museum in Texas, done in pencil on paper that has gone the color of weak tea, no calculations on them anywhere, just measurements in a mechanic's handwriting. Philippine Airlines still flies, and there is a portrait of him in the lobby in Manila, and if you asked the people walking past it who he was, most of them could not tell you. But look at what came afterward. Every armed attack aircraft built since carries the argument he won. The idea that a bomber could be a gun platform, that you could put overwhelming forward firepower on an airframe and use it to suppress a target rather than merely drop things on one, went from heresy to doctrine inside 18 months. The A-26, the gunships over Vietnam, from the improvised AC-47 through the AC-130, which is a transport aircraft turned into a flying battery by exactly the reasoning Gunn used on an A-20 in a Brisbane hangar. The A-10, built around a gun, with the airframe treated as a mounting bracket. None of those aircraft would say they descend from Pappy Gunn. All of them do. And what gets me, every time I come back to this story, is how thin the margin was. Not the margin in the battle. The margin in the decision. A qualified engineering board in Ohio looked at that airplane and said no, and they were not wrong about the aluminum or the balance or the risk. If the chain of command had worked the way chains of command usually work, that assessment would have been the end of it. The strafers get grounded. The convoy reaches Leh with 7,000 men. The New Guinea campaign becomes something much longer and much bloodier, and the road to the Philippines stretches out by months or years. Instead, there was a mechanic who wouldn't wait for permission, a general who backed him, and a war that turned on the difference. The last thing worth saying is the simplest one. Everything in this story that looks like military genius was actually something else. He wasn't trying to invent the gunship. He wasn't trying to change American air doctrine or get his name into the histories, which is just as well, since it isn't in most of them. He was a man with a toolbox, 43 years old, standing in the heat at Eagle Farm, watching sparks come off a welding torch, trying to build something that would carry him 4,000 miles back to a walled compound in Manila, where his wife and 4 children were waiting. He built it. It took 3 years and 1 month. And she didn't recognize him.